Power playlist. Mine would just be hammered. Hi. Okay, everyone. If you could set. I think we're going to start now. Hi. Hi. Hello. Hi. Thank you. Thanks so much. Okay, great. Welcome to Format. My name's Shumon Basar. Thank you all for coming this evening. Thanks to Turi Munthe and to Yuri Pattison, and more about them in a moment. Thank you to Peter, to Manijay, and everyone else who brings Format together. And lastly, if you could turn your phones to silent right now, I'd appreciate it. Thank you. So Power Format is interested in how power works today. How does it persist? How is it reinventing itself? And does power seek more or less visibility than it used to? The Oxford English Dictionary word of the year in 2015 was, quote, face with tears of joy emoji. How many of you have used this emoji regularly? Okay. So it was the first time a non-word became word of the year, and obviously was a reflection of the fact that language, in a kind of interesting way, was almost going backwards, from letters and type back to something like hieroglyphs or pictograms. So this was the word of the year at the end of 2015. Exactly a year later, the 2016 word of the year was post-truth. Also, I think maybe the first hyphenated word of the year that the OED had ever had. So a question for us to think about is what exactly happened between that emoji and post-truth? What happened to us during that time? Laura Poitras has just released a new film called Risk. It's out in the cinemas at the moment. It focuses on the founder of WikiLeaks, Julian Assange. And it starts in 2011, and it comes right up to almost the present moment, certainly just a few months ago. Halfway through the film, she receives an encrypted message which invites her to come and meet someone in Hong Kong. That someone turns out to be Edward Snowden, a contractor for the United States government who copied and leaked classified information from the National Security Agency. Since then, Snowden has been called a whistleblower, a dissident, a traitor, and a patriot. He now has permanent sanctuary in Russia. Laura Poitras went on to win an Oscar for her film. So a few words about my first contributor this evening. Yuri Pattison is an artist who lives and works in London. His artistic world has included routers, humidifiers, surveillance cameras, office plants, and cheap replicas of design classics, moving between the sculptural and the digital. He recently had a really interesting show at the Chisenhale Gallery and has done a number of in situ works at new co-working spaces, which some of you may be aware of. It's kind of new genre of collective spaces, which Turi is responsible for one in Porto, and there are a few here in London. And Yuri's work often pays attention to these new kinds of spaces, particularly that technology and that technology allows to come into being. So he's filmed server farms in the caves of Sweden. And what I'm going to do now is show you one of his recent films. Okay, so this is Yuri's film, which is called 1014. Now, so I'm just going to read out something that Yuri wrote about this film. He says, the viewer is guided through the specific hotel room in which Edward Snowden lodged while in Hong Kong, immediately following his departure from the US. It's the same location as many of the interviews seen in Citizen 4, in addition to the breakthrough Guardian interview that first revealed his identity to the world as the source of the surveillance leaks. An online brochure of room 1014, The Mirror, Hong Kong, can be found here. The video combines stylistic elements from amateur hotel room reviews and fan videos of Hollywood filming locations. In 1014, the visual tour is lightly annotated with diagrams and text elements borrowed from the NSA and GCHQ. GCHQ is the British equivalent of the NSA, documents leaked by Snowden, while also drawing from English translations of Chinese netizen slang. These annotation elements were then flattened by processing them with the anonymity tool Anonymous. So the project, Yuri says, comes from a position of anxiety and lack of clarity following Snowden's revelations. By looking back at this critical location, 1014 meditates on recent history after the Academy Award win for Citizen 4, reflecting on the rapid transition of the story from a political crisis to entertainment, without any significant changes to the political status quo. The format of 1014 is somewhere between a review of an anonymous hotel room and a pilgrimage to a famous movie location, and it draws the arc of this transition. We're just going to watch this for the next few minutes. Peter, could the sound go up, please? So what we have, of course, is this idea that Edward Snowden, Chelsea Manning, WikiLeaks, almost through an act of alchemy, translate the leak into a form of journalism, which is also a form of radical activism. I think Yuri's film obviously comments on some of the spatial consequences of their actions. So after being in Hong Kong, as we mentioned earlier, Snowden was given sanctuary in Russia, but he can't leave Russia. Julian Assange, as you may well know, has spent the last several years in the Ecuadorian embassy here in London, and very much limited to a very modest-sized bedroom, and he has given a number of notable sort of public appearances from his balcony, which has led an artist called Constant Dallart to coin the term balconyism, where he has traced the kind of history of the balcony from the famous papal balcony, also the balcony that Michael Jackson famously dangled his baby over, and that the balcony is a kind of is one of these spaces of power, and that Julian Assange's balcony at the Ecuadorian embassy is a position of power, but ultimately in this constellation of almost utter powerlessness that he has. And then lastly, the space that Chelsea Manning has been confined to all these years, which was that of prison. And much of that time was in solitary confinement. And of course, very, very recently, in the last few weeks, her sentence was commuted, and now she's very active on Twitter. I do recommend following her. She's a fantastic Twitter account. So the last year has also brought to our attention, I believe, the extent to which the impact of digital media is having upon sources of news and information, and also the ways in which we, of course, consume news and information. It's said that each of us exists in, quote, news silos that are neatly predetermined by algorithms to tell us what we already think we believe. Traditional print media has been disrupted for several years already. But now what seems to be even more devastating, even more at stake, is that the very notion of what is true and what is post-true feels disrupted in ways that not only alter our relationship to reality, but also shift the very terms upon which politics takes place, and ultimately power is set. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Turi Munthe. Turi is a partner at North Base Media, an investment firm focused on journalistic enterprise and digital-driven opportunities, very much in emerging markets. He has a history living and working in the Middle East. And beforehand, he founded Demotics, which became the world's largest network of photojournalists. He's one of the people that for many, many years has constantly illuminated the relationship to me between these new digital platforms that we have and the shifts that are happening between our kind of old paradigms of journalism, of truth-seeking, and whatever comes next. So to talk to us about media journalism and much more, will you join me in please welcoming Turi Munthe? Thank you.
Is that good? Is that too close? Am I too close to the microphone?
Peter, is that okay?
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Shumon, for having me. It's great fun. I spoke about something similar a few years ago, and I didn't even try and look for my notes because things have changed so radically in the interim. I think if I read Yuri's film, I'm a lot more optimistic. I'm a lot more optimistic. I'm going to flag that now because I'm going to take us through some of the issues which I think we've got today with news, and then hopefully come out a little bit the other side. Precisely because this is a very fast-changing space, I have absolutely no answers, but what I'm going to hope to do is to touch on a few points which I think are the beginnings of questions which make sense to look at when you're thinking about this power, media, politics play today. So to start with, the things which I think people misunderstand as being different, but in fact are very much the same. Filter bubbles. Filter bubbles has been this, you've seen it all over the news. Everybody's obsessed with the filter bubble. People live in, to Shumon's point, these silos. We're told only things that we already know and opinions that we already share. My sense is that we've never lived, in fact, with a capacity for less siloed information. If you think back to the beginnings of broadcasting, there was really only one TV channel, and at 6 p.m. they would tell you what was going on and you would listen to it. In the newspaper space, there were, in the UK, 4 big newspapers. They were more than news delivery mechanisms. I've always thought of them as communities. So the Manchester Guardian built a community of people who thought about social issues from the left. The Telegraph built a community of people who thought about politics from the right. Their opinion pages were where that community was crafted. And frankly, very, very few people had subscriptions or bought more than a single newspaper. So these news silos that we're supposed to exist in, I actually kind of think that we've broken out of them. Please come on in, Munthe. Another thing that I think is the same but that lots of people call different. Tech as a great lever of change in communications. Tech has always been a great lever of change in communications. I'm going to take the cliched argument and the argument that everybody reaches for just because it's impactful. Gutenberg's Bible was probably much, much, much less important, according to this particular view, than Gutenberg's pamphlets. Gutenberg allowed for the publication of the printing of pamphlets at gigantic scale. And there's a strong argument to say that the person who most understood that technology won the Reformation. Luther, after the articles were hammered onto the church door, built a gigantic network of pamphlet producers. So this distribution, this new technology as an enabler of a particular kind of comms has always been around. So what I mean to say by that is that let's put our anxieties about Cambridge Analytica, the groundwork, and countless others. I saw that Jeremy Corbyn was using Tinder, had hacked Tinder for the last election, with enormous success, probably gaining at least 2 direct seats because of that particular approach. So tech has always been used for politics and for media. Another thing which we think is new but really isn't is flash political movements. MAGA, Make America Great Again, the alt-right, Momentum, the Leave campaign. People were having this argument as well during the Arab Spring. This notion that it would be impossible to start off revolutions without the social media which empowered those movements is, of course, bollocks. If you look at the spread of revolution in 1830 across Europe, it moved from the Carbonari in Italy to the French, the Belgians, the Portuguese, and Brazil within a very short period of time. So lots of things that we think are new, we should just de-anguish a little bit and think, okay, no, these things have happened for a very long time. These are cycles, these are patterns that we should be able to recognize. So that's, I think, some of the things which are the same, but which we're anxious about and don't really think about in perspective. There are lots of things which are different. There's a real shift away from trusting media, and it's very, very clearly the case in the US, but it's also the case here. There's an amazing think tank called the Pew Research Institute, which does surveys of trust across media and trust in politics. And they have been falling off a cliff for the last 20, 30 years. I'm not quite sure why, but I think smart people who've done research here say that it's the polarization of media, this increased polarization, this multiplicity of voices, which in principle should be a good thing, has actually, in a sense, devalued the currency of media generally. And that's obviously a very bad thing. We don't trust politicians. I mean, we've never trusted politicians, but we trust politicians, I think, even less than we do. And partly we can see the blame there. We can lay the blame at politicians, not just because they're shits, but also because they spent the last 20, 30 years telling people that politics was untrustworthy. There's been especially in the US, but also here, but very particularly in the US, the Republican Party has been attacking all forms of government as essentially alien, corrupt, etc. So that's had an impact. That's had an impact too. Another, I think, fairly big shift, but perhaps accelerated by technology, is the fact that we truly don't like gatekeepers anymore. And gatekeepers have truly gone out of fashion. So we haven't liked authority in this country for a very long time. You go back to the Civil War and Magna Carta, not to mention punk. But technology has perhaps accelerated this move away from gatekeepers, and it's allowed us to obviate their role in many ways. I brought this up last time I was here a week ago, but you can see it very clearly in media in the way that, I'll use a kind of a classic example. John Simpson declared in 2002, as the coalition troops rolled into Kabul, that he had liberated Kabul. He's sort of at the pinnacle of journalist as authority, journalist almost as political actor. Fast forward a few years, and very much as you get into the Arab Spring, and you see that Al Jazeera went out of their way not to carry formal, edited, beautifully packaged newsreels of the events that were going on. They went out of their way to get the grainy handheld mobile footage because it felt truer, it felt more real. So again, a shift away from authority to something which feels more authentic, a shift to the kind of validation of subjectivity, all of which is, I think, fantastic in many ways, but you can see exactly how that spins into accelerating fake news or accelerating the questions around facts and facts values. Please come in. Another thing that's changed, another thing which is different is, and this is truly fundamental, and this is fundamental to the biggest question of power and politics, is that I think the economics are different, and the economics are very radically different, and those economics have changed literally in the last 2 or 3 years. Because I can't remember who coined this, but I feel very much that we live now in an age of data capitalism, which is a term I like a great deal because what it suggests is that the value is in the data. The value today is in the data, and we know that from the value that Facebook and Google and Amazon and Apple and all these big platforms, and Palantir, the Peter Thiel terror organization as far as I can see, and multiple others of these, are making from owning our data. But critically, owning our data is what's going to ensure these companies stay as big as they are and bigger going forward. And to many people is the tool through which they will accelerate their monopoly status. So I think that that's also fundamental in terms of what's changed. And the last thing that's changed, and I didn't know whether to put this in the not changed or changed box, is to Shumon's point, is bullshit. And there's an argument that we've always had bullshit, and that bullshit has played a role in multiple media and in multiple politics for a long time. James Ball, who's just written a book called Post-Truth, goes back to McCarthy, who played media in the US almost as well as Trump does today, constantly setting up press briefings, which were only there to say that he was going to have another press briefing, constantly ensuring that he stayed on top of media with lies, with nothing. He did it very well. But that has accelerated. And I think while bullshit has been around a long time, bullshit with a capital B is perhaps a little bit more new as such a widespread currency in media and political economy today. Bullshit, I'm just enjoying saying that word on a microphone. Bullshit as a thing was sort of invented, I mean, as a conceptual box, was first described by a guy called Harry Frankfurt, who describes it, and I think rightly here, not as lies. Lies come from the position of somebody who knows they're lying. They have a truth and they lie. Or it comes from a conversation in which two people say things and one turns out to be a lie because there is a regard for the facts and the truth. Bullshit starts from, I think I've said that 19 times now. That thing starts from a completely different position, which is there is no such thing. There is such a thing, but it categorically doesn't matter. Your game is to win, regardless of whether you're doing it within, outside of what used to be understood as the ring which was, ringed by fact, ringed by objective experience, etc. That's in a sense gone, and I feel that, and that has accelerated. So this post-truth thing, I think, is a thing, and of course we can trace it back to our anxieties about gatekeepers, our anxieties about authority figures, our anxieties about expertise and what those voices of expertise really are, because they tend to look and sound a lot like people like me, and that needs shifting. But we may be gone a little bit too far. Okay, so that's what I think has not changed, and that's what I think has perhaps changed on some level. What does that do to power in media today? On some level, you could say we have and in some countries, I want to frame this by saying that across the world, the Committee to Protect Journalists has been cataloguing a very serious increase in threats against the media and threats against journalism all over the world. But I'm not really talking about that today. On Facebook and in the US and UK and Europe, there's perhaps you could see a surfeit of media freedom, too much of it, because the rules by which media freedom was previously managed have kind of flown out of the window. And a lot of people are very worried that democracy finds it super hard to survive in that kind of context. As Shumon said, I used to spend a lot of time in the Middle East, and the Middle East, which is a space of very total absence of free speech except for Lebanon. Lebanon always struck me as a place which really suffered from too much free speech, not enough rules, everybody being able to spit at each other. And democracy in Lebanon has been a very, very hard-fought, constantly contested space. We risk moving into that. There is an enormous amount of rubbish floating around. And the reason that there's so much rubbish in media is because there are no real checks on it. So legally, it's very, very difficult for anybody to attack bullshit that we see. Financially, there are no repercussions either, because the creation of this fake news, if you want, or bullshit, is often done by organizations that have no financial incentives in repeated, iterated conversations with the public. Let me unpack that a little bit. The reason that The Guardian tries to tell the truth, or that the BBC tries to get their facts right, is because they expect to be around next year. And if they cock up, then you will move away. You'll find another newspaper. You'll go to another broadcaster. If you are the famous Macedonian fake news factory, it doesn't matter to you. If you're Trump, it doesn't matter to you. You constantly repeat. You're constantly pushing on a new kind of agenda. So financially, again, no issues there. And in a sense, what that means is that the bullshit, can be much more actively managed. There's no shame. The rules of the game have slightly shifted. People talk about an Overton window, which you'll have seen all over the news, and essentially what it means is that the safe space for political discourse, that's the Overton window. The things that we can talk about and nevertheless think of ourselves as normal, that has clearly shifted very radically right in the US, and potentially left in interesting ways across parts of Europe. But also, the Overton window from a cultural perspective has also shifted. The things that we're allowed to talk about, the ways that we're allowed to talk, have also changed. What else has changed? What else has happened to media today? The economics of information have changed. We all know this. I'm not saying anything new. But in the age of TV and newspapers, it was the collective package of news that was sold. You sat down, watched the news for half an hour, and it was the package. It was the complicated foreign policy along with the hard-hitting domestic stuff and perhaps a human interest story. That was what was sold. That's over. we shift to Google. Google, what sold there were clearly headlined, clear stories, because they were searched for. When you move to social, the currency, the things which work, are of course the things which are shared, and the things which are shared are of course the identitarian pieces. They are, by their nature, going to be more polarized than everything else. So the money has moved places. What else has changed? Newspapers can't win it anymore. Do you remember it was the Sun what won it? That is completely dead. In the US, not a single mainstream newspaper backed Donald Trump, not even the Dallas Morning News, which had backed every single Republican candidate since the Brits lost it. None of them backed him, and he won. In the UK, people point to newspaper support for Brexit as a sign that maybe the newspapers have still got power, but it's far easier, and I think far more accurate, to look at Corbyn's win, universally considered impossible by the newspapers in the build-up to the last election. Is that a good thing? Newspapers don't have that kind of power anymore? Alternative languages, alternative streams do? Yes, I think it probably is. And there are new rules. So the new rules are, I mean, I think of them from a mainstream media perspective, but one, the mainstream media hasn't the faintest idea how to deal with bullshit. They don't know how to report it. They don't know whether they should report it. There's been endless conversations as to whether the mainstream media, New York Times and co, should even send reporters to White House briefings. Given the whole thing's crap, should they send an intern? Should they send nobody? Is there a bot that could do the reporting for them? They still do bipartisan reporting. So they still say, well, on the one hand we have this, and on the one hand we have the other. And of course, the reason that they do that is because they think that's the tone of authority. They think that's the tone that people will think of as more truthy, when everything points to that no longer being the case. And of course, they're businesses. So this is, we always forget when we attack the Fourth Estate that they're actually, for the most part, apart from the BBC, they're for-profit businesses. And if you look at CNN's reaction to Trump and this constant tussle, which from a journalist's perspective is hideous and mortifying, and CNN is perjuring its soul and everything that it stands for, and is dragging down the media profession in its wake. CNN is a data-driven organization, and its users love Trump stories. So of course they're going to continue to pick those fights. I'm going to talk a little bit about how long do I have?
10 minutes.
Okay, amazing. The final point to make, therefore, about where power plays in media today, we all know this, but it's worth repeating because it really is the cornerstone of all shifts, is that the media itself has been disintermediated. The media used to be the vehicle by which everybody got their opinions across, and of course the media no longer is that at all. It is now the platforms, and the platforms are now that vehicle, that conduit. So let's talk about those a little bit. And by platforms, I mean media platforms, right? So Facebook, Google, Amazon, not just because of Amazon Prime, but also because of Alexa and what audio news will do there. Apple News, Apple Podcasts, which has got something like 70% of the market today. So they're monopolies. They're all monopolies. Before I get hysterical about them, the one thing I want to say is that the people at the top of these organizations are often, again, a kind of a general cultural anxiety. They are often seen as evil geniuses. And in pretty much every case, I think that's not true. Google, I think, does try to not do evil. Facebook's Zuckerberg may be as misguided as you like, but Zuckerberg is convinced that he has a kind of civilizing mission and genuinely believes in democracy a la California, but he genuinely believes in it. I was at South by Southwest, this big tech conference in 2009, at the height of the Iranian failed revolution. And Twitter had just been, I don't know whether you remember, Twitter was about to upgrade their servers, and Hillary Clinton, Secretary of State at the time, called up and said, don't upgrade your servers. You're currently, you're like the pigeon post for the revolution in Iran, don't do it. They sent all their smartest people to South by Southwest, set up a tent for journalists, and got everybody to come in. They care. Even Jeff Bezos, who everybody loves to hate because he's killed so many businesses, Jeff Bezos was basically given the Washington Post by Don Graham. When Don Graham sold in the Washington Post a few years ago. Don Graham went out and sold it to him for a fraction of the value of the company because he thought that Jeff Bezos was the best safeguard of the values of the Washington Post. So the guys at the top, and they're all guys, at the top of these organizations are genuinely trying to do the same thing. That doesn't mean they are doing the right thing. They're just trying to. So let's remind ourselves that. The problem is that they're monopolies. That very many serious publishers get 70 or 80% of their audience from Facebook. And at a certain point, when you're delivering 70 or 80% of an audience to an organization, you've got to start thinking of these players as monopolies, as utilities, like the pipes. They are the pipes. They perhaps need to be regulated as the pipes. They're also fudging. They also say that they're not media organizations. They're just vehicles. They're just the pipes, as I just said. They are mere conduits in English legal language, or safe harbor, or safe harbors in American legal language, so that they're not liable for the stuff that they publish. Of course, they are publishers. They curate. Their algorithms are perhaps the most important news-producing tools around today. So they're in complete fudge here. Why are these monopolies as frightening as they are, despite being run by people who are probably trying at least to be on the side of right? The reason that it's so dangerous to have such a small number of companies as drivers of information is precisely because it makes gaming the system so much easier. If you're Cambridge Analytica, all you need to do is figure out Facebook, because most people get their news from Facebook. I mean, really most people get their news from Facebook. Vast numbers of people, vast majorities of people get their news from that platform. Not only do you just have to figure out how Facebook works, but Facebook has got all the data of all those people, making it that much easier for you. So what it does, in a sense, it accelerates the rate at which the tech, media, power, politics fight takes place. And that we have to be super careful about. I'm gonna run to the end and get back to a little bit of optimism. So we've got very few tech platforms running, pretending that they're not media publishers, owning all audience, curating the news that we see. And that's petrifying, because on some profound level, informational self-determination is what makes us free. I mean, ultimately, that's sort of the thing which makes us free. It's the basis upon which everything else runs. And I wonder whether, looked at negatively, we're getting to a point where the tools are there to allow us to miss what could potentially be a golden age of information and have it all shut down upon us. The golden age of information is that I don't think we've never had as much access to as many different voices, even through Facebook, through Twitter, etc. There are far fewer gatekeepers from a media perspective. It's far easier to find these voices. And I think that on some level, what one might say is that we're just super early in this cycle. Media disrupts itself and has been disrupting itself extremely fast over the last 20 years or so. Where I think we are is in an early phase of a conversation around media companies, platforms, and politics and data companies around them. There's a lovely story. In 1938, The War of the Worlds, H.G. Wells' novel, was broadcast on public radio in the US. It's a novel. And the police across the areas where it was being broadcast received thousands of calls from petrified listeners to The War of the Worlds because they genuinely thought there was a Martian invasion happening. That was the early days of radio. I feel like we're the early days of platform distribution, media, etc. So that's, I think, where we are. I'm going to stop there. Yes, no, so the final point I think that I would make is that to this notion of information on self-determination, we've got all the tools there. Multiplicity of voices, ease of access to information like we've never seen it before. I think the key question going forward are we in a space now which allows for that to truly thrive, this famously self-correcting internet, to continue to improve, to continue to deliver alternative voices, politics to previously non-politicized communities, etc.? Or do we end up in a world which is increasingly owned by the telcos? You've all been reading about net neutrality, is the big debate around net neutrality today, yesterday, and previously. The platform companies that are in an ever more nervous position, desperately trying to avoid being considered monopolies and broken up, while at the same time having to take responsibility for fake news, for hate speech, for everything else. And government, let's not forget, government that has vast amounts of information on us, and government and political parties which use these centralized information systems like Facebook and Google to get more information from us. They've got, I don't know whether you heard about the Karma Police move here in the UK, that taking vast amounts of data from social networks and from our Google searches and from all our activity online to construct a database of who we are. China has been toying for some time with this notion of a citizen score, a way of taking all data from all your online, or all your activities, because pretty much all of them are online, and building a score for everything from credit rating to political viability, etc. Everything, to go back to the point I made earlier, everything is really about the data. And I think that as we look forward, as certainly as I look forward, all the most important conversations about what happens to media, what happens to politics, what happens to power in this space, all end up revolving around how do we regulate the data, who owns the data, how do we have access to it, because that's where because we're in a data capitalist society. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Turi. Before I have some questions for him, and then I'll open it up to you guys, but before we do that, you started out by saying you felt optimistic. I'm keen to know how the audience feels. Those of you who feel optimistic about where we are right now in relation to how we get to shape politics, how we get to express our political agency compared to, let's say, even 5 years ago. Those of you who feel optimistic about the current situation and the current way in which things are going, would you put your hands up now, please? Wow. And those of you who do not feel optimistic? And those of you who are not quite sure, right? So, I mean, significantly more pessimism in the room.
Exactly.
You haven't managed to change their mind. Or maybe you have, and there were even more pessimists in the room before, who knows? Okay, that's really interesting. Maybe we could hear from some of you when you asked Turi your questions. Turi, one of the things you mentioned, I mean, you were here last Friday where Masood Golsorki talked about the shifts in power in the fashion world over the last 30 or 40 years. And he boiled it down to sort of 10, like a chronology of 10 frames almost in this moving saga. And we went from art directors all the way to social media influencers today. And then you've just mentioned Orson Welles. And he after he did War of the Worlds, he made his name in the annals of film history by making a film called Citizen Kane, which was based not just loosely, but in a way quite accurately on one of the world's, well, certainly America, but one of the world's greatest media moguls, William Randolph Hearst. And I was wondering, you said that, one of the things you said very explicitly was that that authority that newspaper owners in particular, like the Randolph Hearsts, the Rupert Murdochs, had for such a long time, where they almost, I mean, the arrogance was such that once they would place their bet on a candidate, and more than a bet, it was a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, ultimately. And what we've just seen, as you commented on, particularly with the recent election in this country, was what felt like the final dissolution of that power-making relationship between those media moguls, or the traditional media moguls, and, let's say, democracy. But should we then feel, I mean, you also characterize Sergey Brin and Larry Page and Mark Zuckerberg as, you know, as relatively benevolent compared to Rupert Murdoch. But are we now going to be in a situation where future political candidates who are running for positions of power are going to stop attempting to convince Rupert Murdoch or even James Murdoch and have important dinners with Mark Zuckerberg and with Larry Page? I mean, is that simply one thing that's happening? I mean, in terms of the transfer of power.
So the Donald kept on inviting all these guys to meetings, and some of them went and some of them didn't. And Peter Thiel was constantly there, thrilled that he could be there. They have to be so very, very careful to not take political sides, because to ensure that they stay as conduits, so they stay that they're legally understood as platforms and not media, that perhaps obviates the possibility for that at scale. The question around media players is whether the reason that nobody listened to The Sun anymore or The Guardian is either because the technology has changed, and that's I think my point, but it also may be because the politics has changed too. And looking back over what happened over the course of the last year and a couple of weeks, so Brexit, Trump, and then now let's think Macron and a re-strengthening of Merkel. Certainly in the UK, US, the people who had historically owned the story, owned the discourse, and owned where it was going, found themselves having got it really wrong. The standard reaction was, it's been stolen from us. The bots have taken over. Robert Mercer and Cambridge Analytica have done these terrible things to us. The media, perhaps unsurprisingly, looked for answers to a state of the world that they had no idea how to recognize. They looked at it in the changing shape of the media. Whereas perhaps that's wrong. Perhaps the way to look at this shift is, this highly political shift, is to look at it, one, in economics, globalization, and how that's played out at an economic level in the US and UK, and two, in politics. So perhaps we spend, I want to re-emphasize how political the world that we are in today, and I want to re-emphasize it specifically because so much of sort of liberal media is convinced that that's not what the issue is. They're convinced that it's the platforms and the tech and everything else that has changed, but we're still in the world that we used to be in. And I think that's not the case.
There was an article recently, a survey had been done on a number of teenagers. I think the average age was 16. And the question was, you know, where do you mostly find truth when you hit upon let's say, a news website or an opinion website? And actually what came back was that they said that they form most of their opinions from the comments section. And that was actually the prime matter, the prime material. And that was where they were navigating whether they fell on one side of a discussion or the other. That's very interesting in terms of, because the idea is, of course, that you have the way that power relationship is meant to work, of course, is you have the main article written by an informed, supposedly informed and hopefully paid journalist or commentator or op-ed, and then the rest of us get to say something about it. But of course, what we've seen and heard is in a way a literal shift and drift from the top of the screen to the bottom of the screen. And I thought it was very interesting that they would then say, well, actually, you know, the stuff that we trust is not at the top of the screen, but the stuff that we have to navigate at the bottom. And I mean, again, in terms of a shift of the authorship of power, that seems to me really profound.
That's fascinating, and I think lots of the things that I was talking about point to that, or talk to that. It's not just a shift in power, it's also a shift in form. Very kind of a radical shift in form. You gesture to it with the up the page, down the page. But I remember the most exciting experiment in journalism a few years ago, to my mind, was this thing called the live blog. The live blog was essentially an article which was you saw all the bits of which an article is finally made, but you saw all the stitching too. So rather than a journalist going through all this information and then 4 hours later writing it up in a structured narrative, as things were breaking, they would drop hopefully verified bits of information in with link points and link passages to it. It's a completely different form of writing, a completely different kind of media experience. And I thought thrilling because it felt empowering to a reader. It felt non-condescending. It was not a fully packaged piece. It was, we're giving you all the data. We've done our best to check it, but here you come, you make your minds up. We understand that we don't need to give you the A to B narrative arc. You'll figure that out yourself. And I think this points a lot to this anti-authority, anti-expert, anti-everything else, which is, in many ways, wonderful, absolutely wonderful. The problem is that there's a lot of baby which gets thrown out with that bathwater when the notion of expertise is thrown out as well, because there you end up with the ground upon which post-truth gets bred.
So, just picking up on what Yuri's film was dealing with, the phenomenon of Edward Snowden, and in a way, there's a sense, what I feel from the film, there's a melancholy in the film. Edward Snowden is no longer there. There's a sort of vague, ghostly feeling, but there's also an emptiness that maybe is the fact that the change that we thought would have come with those leaks, with that information becoming available to all of us, didn't seem to come. Often, in many of the WikiLeaks, there's often a feeling that the most shocking thing is how unshocking international diplomacy is. You know, people are nice to each other at public lecterns, but we know they hate each other's guts. And so you know, often there was, of course, there were incredibly incriminating things and the information that Chelsea Manning in particularly released with regards to the war crimes conducted in Iraq by the American troops. But that moment, it felt like there was a moment a few years ago where the leaker, the data dumper, was also was making a bid to disrupt journalism. And then, of course, if you watch the Julian Assange biopic, one of the things they focus on is the kind of moral decision between a kind of hardcore hacker or a hardcore hacktivist who would say, just release all the information. You know, don't comb through it. It's just out there. Versus, let's say, The Guardian and the Spiegel and the New York Times who were brought in, who said, well, no, there could be really profound consequences to it. People could lose their lives, especially our sources, etc. And it seemed to me that was a very interesting kind of moment, of course, in terms of like the established media and the ethics of established media, and then this kind of Mr. Robot style attitude towards a sort of much more punkish attitude towards journalism, which in a sense is you know, I'm not going to filter it. You make your own mind up. Here's the information, you decide. Has that moment already passed? I mean, was there an impact or legacy of WikiLeaks, of Chelsea Manning on traditional media? Could you talk about that, perhaps?
There are lots of things there. Yes, huge impact. Huge impact. I've just seen an extraordinary not-for-profit which is just coming together, which is raising money specifically to help whistleblowers, psychologically and financially. So there's going to be more of that. At the same time, great, it has had an impact. So WikiLeaks absolutely has had an impact. WikiLeaks is run by an extremely complex and polarizing individual, and that has also had an impact and has played to the strengths of all the people who thought it was disastrous. This whole punk journalism, edited journalism, talks to, again, where I think we are in this kind of media spectrum, which is we're really early days in a completely new ecosystem, and we don't know what the rules are yet. So one, we don't know what the rules are, and two, we haven't yet developed a kind of immunity from all the crap. Perhaps I could get to say bullshit again. But we're in the process of teasing that out. I am in absolutely categorically no doubt that the only way to do WikiLeaks is to do them redacted. Lots of people die otherwise. Lots of people have died. There are fixers, people who help you rent cars in Kabul who've been killed as a result. That is just totally not okay. So how you throw a kind of an ethics and a philosophy of news around all these new technologies, we're still super early days yet. The companies themselves don't know how to do it. The tech has enabled a series of actors who don't know yet and haven't yet played out the ethics or the philosophy around the news that they're doing. And perhaps most important of all, as consumers, we don't know how to deal with all this stuff. Because that's where I think the biggest issue is today. My sense of the immunity that we haven't yet built up is specifically around an excess of information and our incapacity to be able to judge, sift, parse, all that stuff. There's a great PhD by somebody whose name I've forgotten, and I will remember it, and if you want his name, I will tell Shumon. He wrote an extraordinary PhD comparing the media markets in the US in something like, let's say, 1965, 1990, and 2005. And the big shift there, of course, is that in 1965, there were 2 news channels, and everybody got their news from Dan Rather, or whoever it was, at 6 p.m. on CBS. And in 1985, they had cable, and so there was still the nightly news, but there was also an enormous amount of, there was Friends, and there was Friends in multiple different versions of episodes and multiple languages and all the other things. And in 2005, there was, of course, the web. He mapped that shifting media landscape against shifting shifting voting patterns. There was an old line, this extraordinary journalist called Joan Didion, who wrote famously Slouching Towards Bethlehem and the book on the Salvador Wars, and an extraordinary journalist who's still alive, who said in the early 70s, she said, there are only 100,000 American voters. And in fact, it's an interesting reprise today because at the last elections, had 100,000 voters voted slightly differently in 3 states, including Wisconsin and others, Hillary would have won. But what she meant was essentially that the 2 sides, Dem and Rep, well, Dem and GOP, Democrats and the Republicans, were so stuck in their voting patterns, there was very, very few people who crossed the floor that made the difference. Why? According to this PhD, because everybody was listening to an enormous amount of news. It was delivered on a single platform. There was one nightly news show, and you made up your mind. Were you left? Were you right? Done. 1985. Far more variety. You don't have to watch the news at 6 p.m. You can watch Friends. Turns out that swing voters increased by a factor of 5, 10. So there are now, if there were 100,000, there are now 1 million official voters in the US. Why? Because swing voters, and of course let's push it one step further to 2005, vast numbers of swing voters. People cross the floor constantly, voting patterns as we saw. Barack Obama, millions of Barack Obama voters cross the floor to Trump. Why? All of it points to swing voters being the people who are least informed about politics. So here you have again, a surfeit of information in 2005. The web is exploding. And people are swing voting all the time. They're confused about how to structure their own politics. They're confused about how to write that story of where they sit. I sort of think that what this immunity that we need to build is drowned in this kind of information, drowned in the precise politics and ethics of the tech that we use to get that information, by which I mean Google and Facebook and the rest. We haven't yet figured out how to situate ourselves around it. We haven't developed an immunity to it. We haven't figured out how we manage ourselves in that flow of information. That's why we're in shit. That's also why I'm profoundly optimistic, because we'll learn all that stuff.
But are you suggesting that what could happen after post-truth is a return to truth? Or do we just have post-post-truth, post-post-post-truth? I mean, that's what I find, I mean, honestly, really deeply alarming at the moment, is this idea that, I mean, of course, truth was always contested, and it's the very basis upon which, you know, all philosophy is structured upon. But you know, there were certain kinds of facts that we could kind of agree on, but it all seems like it's literally been thrown up in the air, and added with all of these growing distrusts that you talked about. Of course, of politicians, but gatekeepers, of, again, people, the privileged in power, or the privileged who possess the power of, supposedly, of certain kind of truth. You know, the total distrust of all these things, which I think, you know, again, the philosophical traditions of skepticism, incredibly important, incredibly important. But, you know, once we're in this new ecology of post-truth, where, you know, your comment is followed by this half of the room, and my comment is followed by this part of the room, and never the two shall meet. Do you really think there's any way we're going to go back from that?
So I think yes, and I think the signs are already there. I'm sure you've all seen this, but the subscriptions to the New York Times and Washington Post and Financial Times have exploded. Nothing has been better for, in a sense, old, boring, check your sources media than Donald Trump, because people have turned around and thought, fuck, I can't trust all the stuff that I read on Facebook. Maybe I should pay $10 a month to at least trust this stuff. So there is a kind of a return to vinyl, if you want, on that kind of piece. The other thing that I'd say, and I've said it again, and I've said it before, and I'll say it again in a slightly different way, is that it's always been polarized. We talk about post-truth now, in part because we got the current president of the United States, and there's an enormous amount of shit flowing around, and we have Boris Johnson as foreign minister, two people who really have zero regard for facts. I mean, none. That's existed before. But perhaps there's a way of thinking of post-truth. I regularly, because I'm kind of voyeur, go into outright sites and outright chains. Reddit is an amazing place to go and get a different sense of the world. And it's fascinating, because they're not trolls. The trolls are the people that we see on NBC or MSN's Twitter profile. When they are talking to their own community, they're true believers. They really buy it. And they also really believe that the liberal elite, whatever they are a bunch of lying, hideous, power-hoarding, narrative dictating, etc., etc. So we've had those times before, and I reckon the 1970s in the UK are a really, you know, it was a really nice equivalent. Totally different narratives about what the world is made of. Totally different narratives. Impossible crossover between, say, the proper socialist left in the UK and the hard aristocratic right-wing, a mad right-wing in the UK. Those discourses, those narratives have zero Venn diagram middle bit. Maybe we're in a similar space, and maybe we should reframe. We should just critique a little bit this notion of post-truth, put it back into perspective, and because there is potentially an element of us describing post-truth as the media no longer recognizing the world that it supposedly owns.
Thank you. Any questions, you guys? Comments? Yeah, back there. If we just wait for the microphone. Thank you.
Hi. I'm just curious. So you're talking about us kind of learning to deal with too much information, wrong or right, too much. So I'd love to hear from you what skills you think we need in our toolboxes to start learning. You know, is it data literacy? Is it a subscription to the New York Times? What are the things that kind of will help us take steps towards being better at that?
Great question.
Great question. Damn. So, I mean, I think you flagged them. So, data literacy, useful. Should the platforms be doing? There's a lot of conversations today. In fact, today, the whole series of members of Parliament have declared that they want people across social media to be non-anonymized because they're fed up with being bashed by trolls, etc. There are all sorts of conversations around Facebook and Google, but Facebook very particularly, and Twitter, not forcing the anonymous out of their boxes, policing their sites for content, blocking fake news, etc. That petrifies me, of course, because if everybody is getting their news from Facebook, you want Facebook to be as brutally open as possible. You just want it to provide the tools for its consumers to better understand. You want their understanding protected, and so I think I don't know. I also feel like I may be generationally off. I'm 41. I have always had subscriptions to newspapers. I wrote for print newspapers years ago. I feel like I'm okay, but then I go off and look at the alt-right on Reddit and realize that I'm seeing a tiny fraction of what there is too. I don't know. What do you think?
I guess I share your optimism in hoping that the internet self-corrects a little bit and that those solutions are yet to be created, maybe by younger people. Yeah.
I'm with you. We'll together.
Talk more.
Yeah.
Thank you. Anyone else? Over here on managing, please. Over there.
Hi. It's not a question, it's more of a comment, I think, but just because I was on the optimistic side and we were very, very few in the room. No, it's, if you ask like a football player, is he optimistic or pessimistic before a match? It's not a question. It's absurd to ask this question to a football player. Same thing would be absurd to ask this to a guy starting an Ironman. Obviously, he's going to try to win. Obviously, he's going to try to finish the race. Yeah, so optimistic and pessimistic doesn't fit in the equation. And this is a bit my feeling with all that's been said and the situation we're in today. It's not a choice to make because a big chunk of it is inevitable. Yeah, and to support that mini argument, I would say Trump also, to bring it back to the internet, Trump said once, I don't listen to television. Yeah. The problem in that sentence is that nobody listens to television, people watch television. Yeah. And essentially, he was born with the radio, not with the television. Yeah. So obviously, he listens to media. The same way many of our parents told us, stop watching the internet, it's absurd, there's nothing there. Nobody watches the internet. Yet we don't know what we do with the internet. We don't know what the action of the internet is. We do a lot of things on it, but it's not watching. It's not learning, it's not reading, it's a verb, an action that we don't yet know. And I have the feeling, which is why I would be an optimistic, is that it's only to be found, but it won't be found in debates, lectures, or books. It can only be found by actually living it. And so I think that there is another level of struggle and battle to be fought, which is not in the media and the power, which is obviously both terrifying and funny to watch. It's in other stuff and the major changes happening at the level of the family, at the level of a relationship, at the level of my job, things where I still have the power to actually make a change on a daily basis, rather than just be scared to see it on a Facebook feed. So yes, I'm highly optimistic. I just think we need to learn how to play the sport, and that there is no such thing as being pessimistic here, or just stay home, I would say.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yep.
Thanks. Yeah, I think just to the last point, I think that points to the inadequacy of the idea of surfing the web, which is such a passive, sort of inevitabilistic way of looking at internet usage. But with that, we talked a little bit about identity and about anonymity on the web, but then I think in some weird way, we often actually miss the social aspect of social media, the fact that there is an identity behind these things. And I wondered, I mean, you noted quite a bit about how we get into identity groups and how, you know, we're talking about comment sections and the fact that there is an author to some of these comment sections, but it is actually a valued author in a different currency or a different way of evaluating whether it's truth or whether it's actually popularity or friendship. And how our own self-posting and then our own self-censorship or our engagement with other identities and other groups has started to influence some of this as a social media and as a news outlet. That was very convoluted, but hopefully there was a few cogent points in there.
Yeah, it's because actually it's interesting because I realized in the last few times we've been meeting, Turi, like you don't say social media, you just say social. Like it's is that the natural contraction? Like we don't say social media, you just say social, and I find that. So I guess your question is about the social within this broader ecology of media and, right?
I think I agree with everything you've said, and I think you open up something which I didn't talk about, which is the grammar of social, the grammar of interaction. You made that point inside the comment section. The comment section becomes a media in its own, a format of its own, and has particular rules. Ditto Facebook, ditto Twitter. You'll have seen over the last few years this huge row about Twitter being a place of abuse, a place of extremely violent abuse for many, extraordinarily violent abuse for many. Twitter ended up building its own grammar, building its own vocabulary and a particular way of interacting, which happens to be ultra-violent in many cases. Facebook is a very particular and different kind of space. Facebook, which is you're doing it, you think in terms, within a closed group of your friends, but everybody is of course posturing, it's a pose, it's a performance, everything is a performance. So yes, of course, these new channels, these new conduits, force us to take on personalities which are perhaps not ours. And just there change the political language, right?
Did you? Yeah, over here, manager. Yes.
So I'm also on the optimistic side. And one thing that I think is that we're somehow mixing things together. So like the newspaper also has its sections, and you know, like you've got the cartoons and you've got the opinion, and you've got the letters to the director, and you've got like the opinion of the columnist, and sometimes I think that the shift that we're changing that mainly has happened is that each section has expanded and has introduced actors in people that were previously just receptors. So we had in media basically you've got the emissor and the receptor. From basic communication, what like the mass was previously just a receptor, and now everybody is an actor, and I'm highly optimistic because I believe that. The power is no longer on the person that's directing a media, but it's the power of the monster that this whole thing is, because it's expanded through technology. And I think that a key issue on learning how to navigate this or use it is by clearly understanding the different roles, like you just said, like it's very different the way that you act in one way or in one media or in another one. As a personal example, for instance, when you're speaking about bullshit, I think that somehow it reminds me to playground discussions, you know, like when the only point is winning the discussion, and then bullshit appears as a tool to win that discussion. Somehow when in a playground, there's a discussion between two guys, you know, like, certainly there's a circle around of people that go and look at what's going on. But when bullshitting is noticed, like suddenly people start to walk away and go and do the stuff, you know, and like the circle around disappears. And I think that that's a way of self-recognizing what's going on, and you know, like the attention goes to one place or the other. But on the other hand, on a Twitter or all this immediate media as a tool of giving direct information of what's going on in an unfiltered way has a tremendous power. I was in Boston during the Boston attacks and the bombing, and I was actually at MIT, and I lived a block away from the start of the persecution of this guy. And I heard the shooting of the policeman, and I didn't know what, I heard something, I didn't know what happened. I started seeing like lots of police, and the first information that I received was an email from MIT, clearly like, don't walk away. It was, everybody was paying attention of what was going on, because we were all at home, because we were like, the city was closed. And I directly went into the internet and Googled and tried to look for information. And the first tool where you got the information was Twitter. It was the police, Cambridge police account. And then like all the people that lived on the direction of the persecution were posting things and information, like you got like direct images of what was going on. And that is impossible without these platforms. And I think that the power of that immediate information, that it's networked through society, and the role that each of us play when something's going on, that's an extreme case. A concert or what's going on, you know, like on a celebrity point of view, you know, like real-time information. That's a very different aspect, and I think that it might self-regulate, and we need to learn that we have to use the tool not only as as receptors, as we're discussing on what we were fed with, but also as emissors. You know, so.
That I think what you say is right, and just to both your points here. In terms of a cultural shift, we used to have rules for very few people and authority in the hands of very few people. That's broken, and I think that's fantastic, like you do. I think it's wonderful, and the fact that so many people get to contribute to everything. To get into the comments pages of The Guardian, you had to be, 20 years ago, you had to be a trade union leader. To get into the comments pages of The Telegraph, you had to be a duke. Almost certainly, almost literally. That's all gone. That's absolutely fantastic. It's provided voices everywhere. We've swung that way. That's great. The bad part of it is that we threw all that expert out with the authority. And that needs to come back in. So we need to figure out how these grammars work so that we can then develop rules around running them better. We need to work out whether we do need non-anonymized identities on the internet. We need to understand how to your question, how fact-checking works. Does it work? Is it embedded in the platforms? What do we do to repeat offenders, repeat bullshitters? What does the media do when you've got a repeat offender in the White House? Point we were making earlier, do you report? Do you just stop reporting? It's all horseshit, bullshit, something, shit. We haven't figured out what those tricks are, but essentially what we're going to have is a return to some rules, because without rules we end up with this surfeit of information which is genuinely a threat to democracy.
Last question,
Yeah.
Etienne, and then we'll wrap it up.
I agree with what Antoine said, and we talked during lunch about this guy, Cody Wilson, who was able to build a gun from an open source file that he was then able to 3D print and shoot with this gun. And is this sort of, isn't it like this sort of new phases where also the internet can take us, where there's a sort of like back to reality, and it also provides power to like one individual. So like it's enabled to like create this big thing and then redirect the power back to this guy who is able to build a gun. And is that to you an optimistic side of it, or a terrifying one, or like a negative one?
I don't. My gut is to answer on the same terms, which is that we don't have yet clearly defined rules around free speech on the internet at all. So that's completely up in the air, and I don't really know where I sit on a lot of these issues, partly because the tech is changing so fast. Was that your question, or can you amplify that a little bit?
Yeah, no, I was just wondering, like, to me, I don't know why, but like in this documentary that Werner Herzog did about the internet, at the end of the documentary, he had the question to like a couple of people, can the internet dream of itself? And one of them answered like, the internet when it's been created was like something going from A to B, like information, and Google is already the internet dreaming of itself, because it's something else on top of like what the internet was at the beginning. And somehow I think that Trump and Cody Wilson, to me, they're like already Google or social media dreaming of themselves, because they're unable to create these sort of new monsters or like creators, but like they're also unable to give the power back to individuals from something that was created at the beginning for like, you know, to gather people, and now it's like some people just come out of it with like even more power that they were having before it. And I just wonder if, to me, that's also part of like, I mean, Trump is a terrible thing, but that's also what made me optimistic about the internet, is that there's eventually the possibility to come out of it as individual with more power than we had before it. Is that something that makes sense?
That makes a lot of sense, and I think that's, and I agree with you, and I find a great deal of beauty in this surfacing, partly because I so value, and I so value the effects of free speech. From my perspective, free speech is a massive accelerator of cultural change, and so blocking it just stultifies it. Again, we were talking about the Middle East. The Middle East has had no free speech for 40, 50 years, and has essentially stayed in total political and cultural stasis over that period. The emotional, psychological cost to everybody living there is absolutely tremendous. But economic, cultural, political, etc. cost is also immense. So I want as the greatest openness to be able to cycle through these changes as fast as possible. I love memes. They're disposable culture. It's wonderful that these things are spun up and spat out that fast. You get to move to the next one. It's like doing culture on very, very powerful amphetamines, and that's a wonderful thing. Again, the question is, I'm saying something very banal. Culture has always worked in this way. Technology has always enabled new forms of culture, and it's taken culture a while to catch up and understand more or less the things that they should be careful of. We now all know that when Kitchener looks at you and says, well, he's not French, but you know, the war effort needs you, England needs you. We know how to read propaganda posters from the 20s and 30s now. We will learn how to read.
Pepe the Frog memes.
I love it. Exactly. Yeah, but really good point. Really good point.
We've run out of time. Thanks so much for your questions. Will you join me in thanking Turi Munthe for a really fantastic No, she's outside. Okay, just to let you know, the very final Power format is on Friday, and myself and Peter Carl are going to look at the imaginative, dream-like power of Twin Peaks It will be fun. It will be frightening in parts. So I hope to see you then, same place, same time. Thanks very much. See you then. Bye.
You get the power to let power go.